The training facility echoed with the restless energy of recruits who had barely begun their journey. The air smelled of sweat, leather boots, and the faint polish of freshly scrubbed floors. Metal lockers banged shut, voices overlapped, and laughter rose in sharp bursts across the room. The recruits were young, most of them barely out of high school, their confidence swollen by the uniform they had only recently earned. They marched stiffly, as if the weight of the world sat on their shoulders, yet their eyes betrayed the inexperience that no drill could conceal. At the far end of the hall, Emily Carter entered. The moment she stepped through the door, the atmosphere shifted not with awe, but with something colder. Her stride was uneven, her right leg dragging slightly with each step. The limp was faint, but in a room filled with sharp lines and rigid movements, it stood out like a spotlight. Conversations dipped for a second, then rose again with muffled chuckles. A few recruits leaned closer to their friends, muttering remarks not meant for her ears. "Look at her," one whispered. "She won't last the week." "Should have stayed home," another snorted. The laughter stung, though Emily didn't flinch. She kept her gaze forward, eyes fixed on the instructor's podium at the front of the hall. Her expression was unreadable, the kind of composure that could only be honed through years of practice. To anyone watching closely, the limp wasn't weakness, it was history carved into her bones. Yet most weren't watching closely. They saw only what they wanted, someone different, someone to underestimate. Emily moved to her place in line, adjusting her posture until her shoulders squared and her chin lifted. Discipline had become second. Nature to her, not something taught in training manuals, but something carved from necessity. Her uniform was crisp, her boots spotless, her hands steady by her sides. The recruits beside her shifted, their whispers still bouncing like sharp stones, but she let the noise wash over her. She had walked through far worse than whispers. The instructor barked a command, and the recruits snapped into attention. Boots struck the floor in near-perfect rhythm, except for Emily's right leg, which landed a fraction of a second later than the others. The sound echoed tap, stomp, tap, stomp, a subtle reminder that she did not move like the rest. Laughter rippled, again from somewhere behind her. The instructor didn't notice. His eyes scanned the formation as a whole, not the details. Emily clenched her jaw, but refused to turn around. She had expected this. From the moment she re-entered the world of recruits, she knew the limp would draw eyes. It had never been something she could hide, not in this environment where perfection was demanded and uniformity celebrated. But she hadn't come here to hide. She had come to prove to herself, more than anyone, that she could still stand among them, even if the price she paid was one they could never fully understand. Memories tugged at the edges of her mind as she stood rigid in formation. She saw flashes of sand, the blur of chaos, the roar of an explosion that had changed everything. She heard the cries of civilians trapped in crossfire, the shouts of her unit scrambling to respond, the ringing in her ears as pain tore through her leg. She remembered refusing evacuation, holding her ground until the children were safe, until every last civilian had escaped. The limp she carried was not weakness. It was survival etched into every step. But here, among these fresh-faced recruits, that truth was invisible. The morning drills began, and the recruits were pushed through a grueling routine of stretches, push-ups, and sprints. Sweat beaded on foreheads, breaths came heavy, and bodies groaned under the strain. Emily moved with deliberate precision, never cutting corners, never pausing longer than allowed. The limp slowed her slightly on the runs, but she compensated with endurance. While others collapsed at the finish line, gasping for air, she remained steady, chest rising and falling in controlled rhythm. Some noticed, though they didn't admit it aloud. They preferred to cling to their earlier assumptions. Doesn't Matter if she finishes, one recruit muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. She still runs crooked. Emily overheard, but didn't respond. Words were easy. Survival was hard. She had learned long ago not to waste energy on convincing people. The truth always revealed itself, often when it mattered most. By midday, the recruits were exhausted, their earlier bravado dulled by the relentless pace. Yet the snickers returned when the instructor ordered them back into marching formation. Emily's limp, more pronounced now that fatigue tugged at her muscles, was impossible to miss. Each uneven step drew another suppressed laugh, another sideways glance. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing in from all sides. Still, she held her head high, eyes locked forward. Inside, a quiet fire burned. She remembered lying in a hospital bed months after the ambush, doctors shaking their heads, telling her she might never walk again. She remembered gripping the bars of the rehabilitation frame, sweat pouring down her face as she forced her body to obey. Step by step, inch by inch, she had rebuilt herself. The limp was permanent, but so was her resolve. To laugh at it was to laugh at the fight it took to stand at all. And if they couldn't see that yet, she would let her actions speak louder. As the afternoon wore on, the instructor dismissed them for a short break. Recruits scattered, collapsing on benches, gulping down water or leaning against walls to catch their breath. Emily moved to a corner, away from the clusters of chatter. She unstrapped her canteen and took measured sips, her body calm despite the ache in her leg. Around her, the laughter continued in hushed tones, though less bold now. Perhaps they noticed. She hadn't faltered once, that she hadn't asked for leniency. But pride dies slowly, and for now, mockery still felt safer to them than respect. One recruit, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, approached with a smirk. "Hey, Carter," he said, his voice dripping sarcasm. "You planning to march like that into battle? Gonna scare the enemy with your limp?" A few others snickered nearby, waiting for her reaction. Emily lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes with a steady calm that unsettled him more than anger would have. "If you think the enemy cares about a limp," she said evenly, "you've never seen real battle." The recruit shifted, his smirk faltering. He opened his mouth to retort, but found no words. Emily returned her focus to her canteen. The conversation closed. The group drifted away, their laughter quieter this time, their confidence shaken by the weight in her voice. The day drew toward evening, drills winding down, fatigue painting every face. The recruits moved slower, there. Once crisp lines now uneven with exhaustion. Emily, though tired, remained steady, her limp unchanged, but her spirit unbroken. As they gathered for final dismissal, whispers still floated through the air, but they carried a different tone now, less ridicule, more curiosity. Who was she? Really? Why did she carry herself with such unshakable resolve? Emily stood among them, silent and strong, her presence demanding attention without a single word. They laughed at her limp because they didn't understand it. Not yet, but the day would come when the truth would silence every whisper. For now, she endured, step by step, her story hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when the world would finally see what she carried within. The desert sun had a way of draining the life out of everything it touched. Heat shimmered above the cracked pavement, distorting the horizon until buildings looked like mirages. Emily Carter stood with her unit at the edge of a small village, her gear weighing heavily across her shoulders. Dust clung to her uniform, her throat dry from hours of patrol, but her focus never wavered. She scanned every alley, every rooftop, every open window. Out here, silence was never a comfort. It was the space where danger waited to erupt. The village had been tense for weeks. Insurgent activity had increased, and civilians lived in constant fear. Emily's unit had been assigned to protect a convoy delivering supplies, food, medicine, essentials that could mean survival for families caught between war and starvation. She walked at the front, her rifle steady, eyes sharp. Children peeked from doorways, their eyes wide, their small frames thin. Women clutched them close, their expressions caught between hope and dread. Emily's heart tightened at the sight. She had seen too many villages like this, where the innocent bore the weight of battles they never chose. She moved with heightened awareness, her senses alert to every sound. The crunch of boots, the hum of engines, the faint rustle of fabric as civilians shifted nervously inside their homes. And then nothing. A silence so sudden it pressed against her chest like a warning. The blast came an instant later. The ground heaved, fire tearing through the air, the deafening roar of an improvised explosive device shattering the convoys. Lead vehicle. Dust and smoke swallowed the street, screams rising in chaotic waves. Emily was thrown off her feet, the impact slamming through her body. Pain seared her leg as shrapnel tore into it, but she forced herself up, adrenaline overriding. The agony. Around her, the world dissolved into chaos, gunfire cracking, civilians scattering, children crying. She didn't think about her injury. She thought about them. Through the haze, she spotted a group of children huddled near a collapsed wall, frozen by fear. Gunfire rained down the street, bullets ricocheting off metal and stone. Without hesitation, Emily pushed herself forward, dragging her wounded leg behind her. Every step sent fire lancing through her body, but she kept moving. She shouted for the children to come, her voice cutting through the chaos. At first they didn't respond, too terrified to move. She pushed closer, shielding them with her own body as debris rained down. "Go," she urged, her voice raw, motioning. Toward an alley where other soldiers were guiding civilians to safety. "Run!" One by one, they moved, their small hands clutching one another as they sprinted past her. Emily's vision blurred with pain, but she held her ground, firing bursts of cover toward the insurgents emerging from rooftops. Her squad shouted commands, returning fire, trying to regain control of the ambush. She refused to retreat until the last civilian had escaped. A mother stumbled, her infant in her arms, and Emily was there gritting her teeth, pushing her body forward, creating a shield between the woman and the gunfire until she was safely pulled away by another soldier. Blood soaked her pant leg, her boot heavy with it, but she didn't stop. Her radio crackled with frantic voices, calling for medics, reporting casualties, coordinating air support. Emily barely heard them. Her world had narrowed to survival hers, her squads, and the civilians who had looked to her with desperate, pleading eyes. When reinforcements finally arrived, the insurgents scattered, fading back into the alleys from where they had come. The air was thick with smoke, acrid with the smell of burning metal and dust. Emily collapsed against the wall, her body trembling, her leg barely holding her upright. Medics rushed to her, voices urgent, hands steady as they worked to stop the bleeding. She wanted to tell them to focus on others first, but they ignored her protests. Her consciousness flickered, the adrenaline draining from her veins, leaving. Only agony behind. The ride to the field hospital blurred together. The jolt of the vehicle, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, the muffled voices urging her to stay awake. Surgeons took over, their faces hidden behind masks, their hands moving swiftly as they fought to save her leg. Hours slipped into days. When Emily finally woke, she found herself confined to a hospital bed, her leg wrapped in bandages, the machines around her humming quietly. The doctors were blunt. "You're lucky we saved it," one said. "But it won't ever be the same. You'll walk again, but you'll carry it with you." Emily turned her face toward the ceiling, her jaw clenched. Walking again was enough. She refused to let it be the end of her story. Rehabilitation was brutal. The first time she stood, her body shook so violently she nearly collapsed. Sweat poured down her face as she gripped the bars of the rehab frame, forcing her body to obey. Step, drag, step, drag. Pain seared with every movement, but she kept going. Nurses encouraged her, sometimes in gentle tones, sometimes in sharp commands. But it was Emily's own willpower that carried her forward. Day after day, week after week, she pushed. Progress was slow, but progress came. Through it all, she refused pity. When others told her it was enough that she had survived, she shook her head. Surviving was not enough. She had responsibilities still, and she would not abandon them. The limp became part of her, a reminder of what she had faced and what she had chosen. Months later, she was summoned to a ceremony. Dressed in her formal uniform, her limp evident but her head held high, she stood before a crowd as the commander, pinned the medal to her chest. Applause filled the air, but Emily heard little of it. She wasn't thinking about medals or recognition. She was thinking about the faces of the children she had shielded, the mother clutching her infant, the civilians. Who had survived that day? The medal wasn't for her, it was for them. When the ceremony ended, she tucked the medal carefully into her pocket. She didn't hang it on a wall or boast of it to others. She carried it quietly, a reminder not of glory, but of sacrifice. To her, it was never about heroism. It was about duty, about making sure that when the time came, she had chosen courage over fear. Years later, standing in the training facility among fresh recruits, that memory burned as vividly as if it had happened yesterday, every step of eye. Her limp carried echoes of that day, the explosion, the screams, the choice to stand firm despite the pain. The recruits saw only the limp. They didn't see the story behind it. But Emily knew that one day, when the truth emerged, the laughter would cease. For now, she walked silently, carrying the medal hidden beneath her uniform, its weight pressing gently against her side. She never flaunted it, never sought their admiration. She didn't need to. The medal wasn't for them. It was for those who had survived because she had stayed behind, refusing to give in. The recruits might laugh at her limp, but Emily carried with her a truth they could not yet comprehend. Every scar had a story, and hers was written in fire, sacrifice, and unshakable resolve. The morning air in the training camp carried the sharp bite of disciplined boots striking pavement, barked commands cutting through the silence, and the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground during push-ups. Sweat already glistened on the recruits, brows though the sun had only just risen. For most, the rhythm of training was punishing. For Emily Carter, it was another battlefield. Only this time the enemy wasn't insurgents, but perception, mockery, doubt, and the unrelenting whispers of those too young to know better. The limp followed her everywhere, noticeable in the cadence of her steps. It made her stand out in a world that demanded perfect synchronization. When the platoon ran in formation, their boots struck in a near-unison beat. Emily's right foot landed just a half-second later, creating a faint stagger in the rhythm. To others, it was a blemish, a break in the harmony. To her, it was survival itself, the product of a leg rebuilt from fire and shrapnel, proof that she had fought to walk again at all. The recruits did not see it that way. "She's slowing us down," one muttered as sweat dripped from his chin during the run. "She's here for pity points," another whispered, thinking she couldn't hear. Laughter rippled, sharp as glass. They thought they spoke in secret, but Emily's ears were trained for danger. She heard every word. She felt the sting of their doubt, though her face remained unmoved. Inside, her thoughts burned. These recruits so young, so sure of themselves, had never tasted the chaos of a battlefield. They believed strength meant speed, precision, and flawless rhythm. They didn't yet understand the kind of strength it took to crawl through rubble with bloodied hands, or to rise again after your body was broken. Emily didn't correct them. She didn't waste her voice on explanations. Words could be twisted, ignored, forgotten. Actions spoke louder. And so she worked relentlessly, methodically, with a quiet fire that no insult could extinguish. When the drill sergeant dismissed them after a punishing set of sprints, most recruits collapsed onto benches, gasping for air, their bodies trembling. Emily, though her leg ached and her muscles burned, stayed on her feet. She moved to the training range, where targets stood waiting in neat rows. Adjusting her stance, she steadied her rifle, sighted, and fired. One shot, another. Each bullet landed with precise accuracy, puncturing the paper target's dead center. A few recruits wandered over, curious. Some folded their arms, smirking, waiting for her to fail. Instead, they watched as she reloaded and repeated the exercise. Her limp didn't matter here. Her hands were steady, her aim sharp, her focus unbroken. By the time she lowered the rifle, the targets bore clustered holes at their centers. Without a word, she set the weapon aside and moved on to the next drill. Later, during strength training, she pushed herself until sweat drenched her uniform. While others groaned and dropped, she forced her body to complete every repetition. Push-ups, pull-ups, planks, she finished them all, slower perhaps, but without quitting. Her limp made balance harder, but it didn't stop her. If anything, it sharpened her determination. By evening, whispers followed her again. But now, there was something different in the tone. Some still mocked, clinging to their pride, but others watched with unease. They had seen her refuse to yield when most would have. They had seen the steadiness in her eyes, the kind of calm that training alone couldn't create. One recruit, a wiry young man with restless energy, sneered as she walked past. "All that effort, and you still can't keep up," he said under his breath. Emily stopped, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze. Her eyes were calm, not hostile, but they carried a weight that silenced him mid-laugh. "It's not about keeping up," she said softly, her voice even but edged with steel. "It's about not quitting." The recruit faltered, unsure how to respond. She moved on, her limp steady, her back straight. The silence that followed was louder than his insult. At night, when the barracks quieted, Emily lay awake on her bunk. Her body ached, the scar tissue in her leg throbbing with each pulse of blood. She stared at the ceiling, the whispers of the day replaying in her mind. For a moment, doubt threatened to creep in. Was she truly proving anything? Did her presence here matter? Then she remembered the faces of those children, the grip of tiny hands clinging to her arm as she led them to safety. She remembered the commander's words when the medal was pinned to her chest. "You chose courage when fear was easier." That reminder was enough. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, allowing the exhaustion to wash over her. Tomorrow, she would rise again. Tomorrow, she would work harder. The next day, drills resumed with even greater intensity. The recruits groaned under the weight of new exercises, obstacle courses, rope climbs, mud crawls. Emily faced them all. The rope climb was brutal. Her leg protested every pull, every inch upward. The recruits surged past her, some cheering, others mocking. But Emily didn't look at them. She focused on her hands, one above the other, her body straining but climbing steadily. She reached the top slower than most, but she reached it. And when she descended, her uniform streaked with dirt, her expression remained calm. The obstacle course became her battleground. Crawling through mud, vaulting over barriers, dragging herself under barbed wire, each challenge tested her resolve. Some laughed when she struggled to hoist herself over the final wall, her injured leg catching on the edge. But Emily didn't stop. She gritted her teeth, shifted her weight, and pulled herself over with sheer willpower. When her boots hit the ground, she stood taller, her breath ragged but victorious. By now, even the loudest mockers had grown quieter. They couldn't ignore what they had seen. She didn't quit. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for sympathy. While others groaned about blisters and sore muscles, she pushed through injuries that would have sidelined them. A few recruits began to look at her differently, not with respect, not yet, but with uncertainty. She was no longer the weak link. They thought she was. She was something else, something they didn't fully understand. That night, as the recruits sat around cleaning their gear, conversations shifted. Some still cracked jokes about her limp, but fewer laughed. One asked quietly, "Why is she even here, if she's already injured?" Another shrugged, "Maybe she's tougher than we think." Emily heard none of it. She sat in silence, polishing her boots, her movements precise. She didn't care about their debates. She cared about the promise she had made to herself in the hospital bed, that her story wasn't over, that she wouldn't be defined by scars. Day by day, she proved it. Not with speeches, not with demands, but with every action, every drop of sweat, every step of her limp that carried her forward when quitting would have been easier. The recruits still whispered. They still watched. But slowly, without realizing it, they began to see that Emily Carter wasn't there to fit in. She was there to endure. And in endurance, she was unmatched. The announcement came just before dawn, carried on the sharp voice of the drill sergeant who stormed through the barracks. "Listen up! A general's coming to observe training today. You will be in full uniform, boots polished, gear squared. Away, formation perfect. If you embarrass this unit, you'll regret it. Am I clear?" A thunder of "Yes, sir," echoed through the cramped room. Recruits scrambled from their bunks. Boots hit the floor, uniforms were straightened, and nervous energy filled the air. For many, this was the first time they would stand before a general. The thought alone was enough to rattle even the most confident among them. Some whispered about impressing him, others worried about mistakes. Emily Carter dressed quietly, moving with deliberate calm. Her limp made certain tasks slower, lacing boots, fastening straps, ensuring everything was aligned, but she completed them with precision. While others rushed, she worked steadily, her hands practiced from years of discipline. She didn't share their nervous chatter. She had stood before generals before, though never under circumstances like this. Today, she wasn't being honored or recognized. Today, she was just another recruit, expected to blend into the formation. The problem was, Emily never blended in. By the time they lined up on the training field, the rising sun painted the horizon, with strokes of orange and gold. Dust clung to their boots, the air already warming with the promise of a scorching day. The recruits stood shoulder to shoulder, uniforms crisp, eyes forward. The only sound was the faint rustle of fabric as they shifted into position. Emily took her place in the line, her limp unavoidable as she moved into stance. Though no one dared speak aloud, she felt the ripple of judgment around her. Even here, on a day when perfection mattered most, she was the outlier, the flaw in the otherwise uniform picture. "Straighten up," someone hissed behind her. "Don't mess this up for us." She ignored it. The drill sergeant barked an order, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Stand at attention." The recruits stiffened, their bodies snapping into rigid alignment. Emily followed, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, her hands firm at her sides. Her stance was as strong as anyone's, though the unevenness of her leg betrayed her. Moments later, the general arrived. The air seemed to change as he stepped. onto the field. Conversations from nearby units ceased, and a hush fell over the recruits. He was a tall man, his uniform immaculate, his presence commanding without effort. His gaze swept across the line like a spotlight, sharp and discerning, missing nothing. Soldiers who moments before had been confident now felt exposed, vulnerable under his scrutiny. He began his inspection slowly, moving down the line one recruit at a time. His boots crunched softly against the gravel, his eyes lingering on uniforms. Posture, discipline. Occasionally he paused to correct a strap, adjust a rifle, or issue a curt remark. Each recruit braced under his gaze, desperate not to falter. Emily stood still, her eyes fixed ahead, though she felt his presence drawing closer. Her pulse quickened, but not from fear. She had faced worse than inspections. Yet something about his measured steps, his air of quiet authority, stirred memories. Of ceremonies past, moments when medals were pinned to her chest, when speeches echoed about sacrifice and duty. She pushed the memories aside. That was then. This was now. When the general stopped in front of her, the silence deepened. His gaze lingered longer than it had on others. Emily felt it, heavy and searching, as though he were peeling back layers. Her limp had not escaped his notice. She saw it in the narrowing of his eyes, the subtle tilt of his head. Most saw her limp and dismissed her. His expression suggested something different: recognition, perhaps curiosity. He studied her face, her posture, the way she held herself with quiet composure despite the flaw in her stride. He stepped closer, his eyes dropping to her uniform. For a moment, Emily's breath caught. She had always been careful, always tucked the metal ribbon neatly into her pocket, hidden from view. But uniforms were thin, and even the faintest outline could sometimes be seen. The general's gaze lingered at her chest pocket, with a faint rectangular shape pressed against the fabric. His brow furrowed, as if trying to place a memory. Behind her, the recruits stood rigid, though she felt their anticipation like static in the air. They had mocked her limp for weeks. Now they watched, waiting to see if the general would notice it too. Some hoped he would call her out, expose her weakness. Others simply waited for the drama to unfold. The general broke. A silence. His voice was calm, deliberate, carrying easily across the field. "Step forward, soldier." Emily obeyed. Her limp was evident as she moved, each step measured, steady, unashamed. The recruit's eyes followed her, curiosity and confusion swirling. She stopped in front of the general, standing tall despite the weight of every gaze pressing on her. Back, the general studied her for another long moment before extending his hand toward her pocket. "Permission to inspect, soldier?" "Yes, sir," Emily replied, her voice even. With deliberate care, he reached into her pocket. Gasps rippled through the line as he pulled out the metal tucked within. Sunlight caught on the polished surface, sending a sharp gleam across the field. The sight silenced the recruits. Their whispers, their laughter, their mockery, all died in an instant. The metal spoke louder than words. The general held it up, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with recognition. Slowly, he turned to face the recruits, the metal glinting in the light. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The recruits remained silent, their faces pale. "This is not decoration. This is not for display. This is a symbol earned through blood, through sacrifice, through courage few of you can yet imagine." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he turned back to Emily, his tone shifting, softer yet filled with respect. "And she carries it quietly, not for recognition, not for glory, but because she lived through what others did not." The recruits shifted uncomfortably, shame written across their faces. The ones who had mocked her limp stared at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. Emily stood motionless, her face calm, though her heart pounded. She had never wanted the medal to be revealed here. She had never wanted their respect to be forced upon them, but now it hung in the air, undeniable. The general lowered the medal and handed it back to her. "Carry it with pride, soldier. You've earned it." Emily took it, sliding it carefully back into her pocket. She nodded once, her voice quiet but steady. "Yes, sir." The general moved on, continuing his inspection as though nothing had happened. But the recruits knew something had shifted. The whispers would not return, not after what they had just seen. For Emily, the moment was heavy, but it was not triumph. It was a reminder of the day she earned that medal, of the lives saved and the pain endured. She did not seek their admiration, only their understanding. And perhaps now, finally, they would begin to see. The general's hand lingered in the air. After returning the medal to Emily, his boots shifted against the gravel as he slowly turned to face the formation. The recruits stood frozen, their rigid stances betraying the turmoil churning beneath. The surface, what they had just witnessed, clashed violently with every assumption they had carried since training began. The limp they had mocked, the silence they had misread, the soldier they had dismissed, all undone by the glint of a medal they barely understood. The general's voice cut into the silence, sharp but controlled, carrying the weight of experience. "Do you know what this represents?" he asked, holding his hand out as though the medal still rested in it. No one spoke. The recruits stared straight ahead, faces drained of confidence. A bead of sweat rolled down the temple of one soldier in the front row. Another swallowed hard, as though words might rise, but were immediately crushed by the general's authority. The general stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the line of recruits. His eyes, hard as steel, swept across them. "This isn't jewelry. This isn't for decoration. It's not something you polish to look sharp on inspection day. This is earned through blood, through fire, through decisions made in moments when hesitation means death." His words struck like hammer blows. Each syllable carried weight, pressing down on the young recruits until their shoulders seemed to sag under the invisible burden. The general paused and pointed toward Emily, who stood at his side with her chin lifted, her expression unreadable. "Do you see her?" he asked. "You've laughed at her limp. You've whispered when her back was turned. You've mistaken quiet strength for weakness. And yet she has carried more than most of you ever will. That limp you mocked? It was bought with shrapnel, with torn muscle, with pain that would break lesser soldiers. And still she stands here." A heavy silence followed. No one dared glance at Emily, though her presence felt impossible to ignore. The general continued, his tone steady, but sharp enough to cut. When the moment came when civilians were trapped under fire, when the easy choice would have been to retreat, she chose to stay. She chose to fight, not for medals, not for recognition, but to save lives. Children lived because she stood her ground. Families survived because she put herself in the path of danger. And for that, she carries this honor. He paused again, his eyes scanning their faces. Some recruits clenched their jaws, others shifted their weight, but none spoke. Shame hung heavy, thicker than the morning heat. "Do you think you're sharp? Boots and polished brass make you soldiers?" The general asked, his voice rising slightly. "Do you think standing straight in formation is enough? No. A soldier is measured in moments of truth, and none of you know what you are until that moment comes. She does. She's lived it." The recruits stood silent, their earlier bravado stripped bare. Every word landed, reshaping their perception, burning away arrogance and ignorance. Emily remained at attention, though her heart tightened with each phrase. She hadn't wanted this spotlight, this forced unveiling of her past. The medal was supposed to remain tucked away, a private reminder of a day etched into her bones. Yet here it was, displayed before her peers, transformed into a lesson. The general's eyes softened for a fraction of a second as he glanced at her. Then he turned back to the recruits, his tone shifting from condemnation to challenge. You will learn from her. You will understand that the uniform you wear demands more than appearance. It demands sacrifice, resilience, and humility. And if any of you believe that laughter, mockery, or judgment has a place in this unit, you are unfit to serve. The silence deepened. A crow cawed in the distance, breaking the stillness, but no one dared move. Finally, the general stepped back, his boots crunching on the gravel. He folded his hands behind his back and lowered his voice, the sharp edge replaced by something quieter, heavier. You are young, you are eager, but you are not yet soldiers. Not until you understand that this, he tapped his chest where Emily's medal had pressed, isn't about you. It's about those who cannot fight for themselves. It's about the ones who depend on you. And until you carry that weight, you will not understand what it means to wear this uniform. The words hung in the air, unshakable. Emily's breath steadied. She had braced herself for shame, for pity, for eyes full of doubt. But as the recruits stood there, silent and chastened, she saw something shift. Their smirks were gone, their whispers silenced. For the first time since she arrived, they looked at her not as an outsider, but as something else entirely. Respect. It was subtle, unspoken, but it was there. The general gave a final glance at the recruits. Dismissed, he ordered curtly. The formation broke slowly, almost reluctantly. Boots shuffled against gravel, uniforms shifted, but no one spoke. The recruits who had once snickered behind Emily's back avoided her gaze, their faces taut with guilt. Others risked quick glances at her, eyes wide, as though seeing her for the first time. Emily turned, her limp steady, her head held high. She didn't need their pity. She didn't even need their respect. But as she walked away, she felt the weight of the moment pressing behind her like a tide turning. For weeks, she had endured laughter. Now, silence followed her instead. That night in the barracks, whispers rose again, but they were different this time. No mocking tones, no cruel laughter. Instead, it was hushed conversation. Did you see that medal? She really earned it? Save civilians, the general sighed. The story spread like wildfire, reshaping her image in their minds. For some, it sparked admiration. For others, guilt gnawed at their pride. And for a few, it planted seeds of doubt about their own strength, wondering if they would have stood their ground as she had. Emily lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The medal rested on the small table beside her, its shine dulled by the shadows. She had never wanted it to be revealed like this, never wanted to be defined by a piece of metal. To her, the true weight of it wasn't honor, it was memory. Faces of civilians, the screams of battle, the tearing pain in her leg. The medal was the world's way of saying thank you. But it would never erase what she carried inside. Still, as the whispers shifted, as respect slowly replaced ridicule, she allowed herself a quiet breath. Not relief, she didn't fight for their approval, but acknowledgement. Maybe now they would train harder. Maybe now they would begin to grasp what it meant to wear the uniform. The general had seen to that. And tomorrow, when the sun rose, again and drills began anew, Emily would be their Limp, and all proving once more that true strength is never about perfection. It's about endurance. It's about carrying on when the world tells you to fall. And she would carry on medal. Hidden once more, silence her shield, resilience her greatest weapon. The next morning began with a tension, unlike any Emily had felt since arriving at the training camp. Normally, reveille brought with it the usual flurry of movement. Boots hitting the floor, hurried attempts to make bunks tight enough to bounce. a cooing, and the grumbling of half-awake recruits preparing for another grueling day. But today the barracks buzzed with something heavier. The laughter that had once colored the mornings had vanished. In its place hung whispers that were cautious, muted, almost reverent. Everyone knew what had happened yesterday. Everyone knew about the medal. Emily tied her boots with steady hands, ignoring the furtive glances darting in her direction. She could feel their eyes on her back, as if they were waiting for her to confirm what the general had already revealed. She gave them nothing, no acknowledgement, no denial, just the same quiet discipline she had always carried. By the time they fell into formation on the parade ground, the air was thick with anticipation. The recruits stood straighter, their uniforms sharper, as though they all sensed today was no ordinary inspection. And they were right. The general returned. His arrival brought silence once again, but this silence was different from yesterday's. Nervous quiet. This was heavier, filled with expectation. His boots crunched over the gravel as he walked to the front of the formation, his presence commanding without effort. He didn't begin with inspection. He didn't even glance at their uniforms. Instead, he stood in front of them, his hands folded behind his back, and simply looked out over the sea of young faces. "You all saw what happened yesterday," he began, his voice steady, carrying across the field. "You saw something many of you didn't understand, and you made a discovery that should change you." The recruits didn't move. They stood, frozen, eyes locked forward. The weight of his words pressed down on them like the midday sun. "You laughed," the general said, his gaze sweeping slowly across the line. "You mocked a limp you couldn't explain. You saw weakness where there was strength. That is the mistake of the inexperienced, of those who believe soldiering is about appearances. But soldiering," he paused, his voice deepening, "is about sacrifice. It is about endurance. It is about courage when everything in you screams to run." His hand lifted, pointing toward Emily. She felt every eye shift to her, the weight of their gazes heavier now than any insult had ever been. "This soldier knows what that means," the general continued. "She carries proof in her body and in her heart. That medal you saw isn't hers alone. It belongs to every life she saved, every person who stands today because she refused to fall." Emily held her ground, her jaw set. She had never wanted to be a symbol, never wanted her limp or her medal to define her. But now, under the general's words, she understood she wasn't just being exposed, she was being used as a lesson. The general let the silence linger before speaking again. "And now," he said, turning toward her, "they will hear it from you." Emily's chest tightened. She hadn't spoken of that day in years, not beyond the sterile words of official reports, not beyond the quiet admissions to doctors who asked about her injury. The memory lived inside her, raw and unshakable, but never shared aloud in this way. And yet the general's gaze demanded it. "Yes, sir," she said softly. She stepped forward, her limp clear against the gravel, and faced the formation. Rows of eyes stared back at her. Some were wide with curiosity, others with shame, but none carried mockery now. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself. "It was a village," she began, her voice even, though the images returned as vividly as the day they were burned into her mind. Civilians were trapped between crossfire. Mothers, fathers, children. They had nowhere to go. Our unit moved in to get them out. She paused, her throat tightening. The recruits remained motionless, waiting. "We were ambushed," Emily continued. "The blast hit before I even knew it was coming. My leg was torn apart. Every instinct told me to stay down, to let others carry me. But I saw those civilians terrified, frozen, waiting to die. I couldn't let them. Not while I could still move, still fight." Her voice wavered for the first time, but she pressed on. "So I stood. I shielded them. I fired until my rifle burned in my hands. I refused to fall, not until they were safe. When the dust cleared, they were alive. And she touched her leg unconsciously, the limp heavy in her memory. I wasn't the same. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a boot shifted, not a breath seemed to stir. Emily's story hung in the air, wrapping itself around the recruits like a weight they had no choice but to carry. I didn't do it for a medal, Emily said finally, her voice firm. I did it because that's what wearing this uniform means. It means others before yourself. It means standing when you want to fall. That's the lesson. And if you don't understand, then you don't belong here. She stepped back, falling into line once more. The general's eyes burned with respect as he turned back to the recruits. His voice rang out with renewed force. You heard her. That is what a soldier is. Not the sharpness of your salute, not the shine on your boots, not the speed of your run. It is the willingness to give everything, even your body, even your future, for someone else's life. That is the cost of this uniform. And if you cannot pay it, then you do not deserve to wear it. The recruits' faces were pale, their jaws tight. Some blinked rapidly, fighting emotion. Others stared fixedly ahead, unwilling to risk breaking. Discipline, though their hearts churned inside. The general stepped closer, lowering his voice, but making it no less sharp. You will train harder from this day forward. You will watch how you treat each other. And when you see weakness, you will look deeper, because sometimes weakness is strength in disguise. Sometimes the limp you mock is the mark of someone who already lived what you have only begun to imagine. He let the words linger before. Stepping back, his final command came like thunder. Remember this lesson. Let it shape you. Because one day, when your moment comes, you will not have time to wonder if you are ready. You will only have time to act. And on that day, you will. Either stand like she did, or you will fall. He turned sharply and walked away, leaving silence in his wake. The recruits remained frozen, their eyes forward, but their hearts unsettled. They had been stripped bare, their arrogance burned away, their illusions shattered. And standing quietly, among them was Emily Carter, still silent, still steady, her limp unhidden, her strength undeniable. Not night, no one whispered. No one laughed. The barracks were quiet, each recruit alone with their thoughts, replaying the general's words, replaying Emily's story. Some felt guilt, some felt awe. All felt changed. And Emily, lying in her bunk, stared at the ceiling. She hadn't wanted to speak, hadn't wanted to relive it. But maybe, just maybe, her words had given them something more than discipline could. Maybe they now understood. Not medals, not appearances, sacrifice. That was the heart of the uniform. The morning sun stretched across the training camp like a pale warning, casting long shadows over the parade ground. The recruits assembled, their uniforms sharper, movements more deliberate, and whispers almost non-existent. Yesterday's revelation had lingered in the air like smoke, unseen yet inescapable. Emily Carter, standing in formation, felt it press against her even before the drill sergeant arrived. For the first time since she had arrived, the atmosphere was different. The mocking glances were gone, replaced by cautious acknowledgement. Some recruits stole hesitant looks at her, curiosity mingled with the remnants of guilt. They remembered the limp they had laughed at, the words they had whispered behind her back, and the general's unwavering recognition of her sacrifice. Emily's boots struck the ground as she adjusted her stance, her limp as steady as the rhythm of her breath. She felt eyes on her, measuring her not for ridicule, but for guidance. Some would come today seeking it. She wasn't sure she wanted to give it, yet the weight of yesterday's lesson made her realize that leadership could not always be avoided. The drill sergeant barked commands, and the recruits snapped into action. Running drills, push-ups, and obstacle courses unfolded under the unyielding sun. Emily moved through each exercise methodically, her limp evident but no longer a source of judgment. She kept pace with her own standards, neither speeding up for approval nor slowing down for sympathy. A recruit, one who had previously mocked her without hesitation, approached during a short break. His face was flushed, but his eyes carried a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "Carter," he said, voice low, almost tentative. I wanted to ask, how did you do it? I mean, survive that?" Emily looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, succinctly. "Focus. Discipline. Don't wait for courage to find you. Take it when you need it." The recruit nodded, swallowing hard, as though the weight of her words settled inside him. He turned back to his squad, glancing over his shoulder at her with something like newfound respect. Others began to follow, quietly. Small clusters formed near her bunk, near the mess hall, near the training range. They asked questions about drills, about endurance, about pushing past pain. Emily answered with care, measured words, revealing just enough of her experience to teach without glorifying. "You have to want it," she told them one afternoon, while leading a rope-climbing exercise. "Not for medals, not for recognition. You have to want it for yourself and for those who count on you. That's what keeps you moving when it hurts. That's what keeps you alive." Her words, simple but firm, had an immediate effect. The recruits who had doubted their own endurance pushed harder, trying to emulate her example. Some faltered, some succeeded, but all of them carried a new awareness, a respect for resilience that had been absent before. The days that followed were not easy for Emily. Mentorship, even reluctantly assumed, carried its own burdens. She was patient, but the old habits of arrogance and immaturity didn't vanish overnight. Some recruits tested her silently, attempting shortcuts or skirting rules. Others hesitated at obstacles, uncertain whether they could meet her expectations. And yet, she remained steady. She did not scold harshly, nor did she praise prematurely. Her presence alone became the measure of standard. During one evening drill, the obstacle course stretched before the recruits like a gauntlet. Mud, rope swings, barbed wire, and walls demanding strength and strategy awaited them. Emily moved first, her steps deliberate, her pace steady. She navigated the course with calculated precision, setting a model for the others to follow. Her limp did not slow her as much as it had before. Years of conditioned endurance made her movements deliberate, each step a silent declaration of perseverance. A recruit stumbled halfway through the course, freezing in the mud as fatigue threatened to consume him. Emily was there before a command could be issued, her hand steady on his shoulder. "Move with control," she instructed calmly. "Don't panic, one step at a time." He hesitated, then followed her guidance, completing the obstacle with newfound confidence. Around them, other recruits watched, whispers of admiration replacing the derision that had once dominated their conversation. That evening, back in the barracks, Emily sat quietly polishing her boots. The metal lay hidden beneath her uniform untouched, yet its presence lingered like a silent reminder of what she had endured. Recruits approached her, some timidly, some boldly, seeking advice on drills, endurance, and strategy. She answered, with clarity, her experience becoming a living lesson rather than a relic of the past. One recruit, the same who had approached her first, lingered nearby. "Carter, why do you care?" he asked quietly. "You could ignore us. You could just do your own thing. Why help?" Emily paused. She didn't answer immediately. They. Words were simple but had depth. Because someone did the same for me once. And because I know what it's like to need guidance and find none. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because it's the right thing. The recruit nodded, and a silent understanding passed between them. Others watched from a distance, slowly recognizing that Emily's strength was not just physical. It was moral. It was courage paired with humility, endurance paired with wisdom. Days turned into weeks. Emily's influence spread quietly but effectively. The recruits who had once mocked her limp now followed her lead in drills, sought her advice in private, and mirrored her determination in public. Their respect was earned, not demanded. And Emily, who had never sought recognition, found herself shaping the very culture of the unit simply by standing firm and refusing to compromise her principles. The general, observing from a distance during one exercise, noted the transformation. With quiet approval, he had brought Emily to the attention of the recruits as an example, but the effect went beyond expectation. It was one thing to speak of courage, another to embody it so completely that others could not help but follow. Even so, Emily remained cautious. She had learned that respect could be fragile, that admiration could sour into envy or resentment. She maintained distance, allowing the recruits to grow while keeping herself grounded. Her past had taught her that leadership came at a cost, and she would not let pride cloud judgment or humility. By the end of the week, the unit had shifted. The whispers had changed. Laughter at weaknesses had ceased. Teamwork had improved. Confidence now came not from mocking others, but from watching each other persevere. Emily walked through the ranks, quiet and steady, her limp visible but irrelevant. The lesson she carried, the story of endurance, courage, and sacrifice, was now living in the behavior of every recruit. And for the first time in months, Emily allowed herself a small sense of fulfillment. Not pride, not triumph, not recognition. Just a quiet acknowledgement that her past, her pain, her perseverance had become a force for change. She had turned whispers of mockery into lessons of strength. She had transformed doubt into respect. And in doing so, she had reminded herself why she had endured everything in the first place. Not for medals, not for glory, but to ensure that courage could inspire even in the smallest of spaces. The recruits no longer whispered behind her back. They watched, they listened, they learned. And Emily Carter, with her limp and her hidden medal, continued to walk among them, steadfast, unyielding, and quietly commanding the kind of respect that no words could ever fully describe. The sun rose slowly over the training camp, casting long streaks of light across the parade ground. For Emily Carter, mornings had always been a test, a repetition of endurance and discipline. But today felt different. There was a subtle shift. In the air, a quiet energy that hinted at completion rather than struggle. The recruits moved with purpose, their faces sharper, their steps more deliberate, their whispers absent. Weeks of training, guidance, and observation had transformed them. They no longer mocked weakness, they understood it. They no longer whispered about flaws, they respected endurance. And at the heart of it all stood Emily, quietly embodying the lessons they had only just begun to grasp. The general arrived. Again, this time for the final evaluation before the unit would be certified for deployment. He walked slowly along the formation, his eyes scanning every recruit with precision, noting posture, coordination, and teamwork. But as he neared Emily, his gaze softened. The medal, still hidden beneath her uniform, remained a silent testament to what she had endured. "You've made an impact," he said quietly, almost to himself. Not just on the recruits, but on the unit itself. Emily nodded once, accepting the acknowledgement silently. She had never sought praise, and she didn't need it. Her mission had always been about action, about setting an example through perseverance rather than words. And yet, hearing it quietly from someone who understood the cost of true sacrifice carried its own weight. The recruits stood in formation, awaiting inspection. Unlike previous days, their movements were fluid, synchronized, and precise. They carried themselves with confidence, not arrogance, not false bravado, but the quiet assurance of those who had been tested and guided, who had seen courage firsthand and understood its meaning. The general's voice broke the silence. "Fall. Out. Assemble around me." The recruits obeyed immediately, clustering around him in neat lines. Emily stepped aside, allowing the others to take focus. But she remained close, her presence unmissable, a living example of endurance and quiet authority. "Yesterday, I watched you," the general began, his voice steady, commanding attention. "And today, I see growth. I see a unit that has learned what it truly means to wear the uniform. You have been tested, not only in drills and exercises, but in judgment. You have faced the example of a soldier who has already endured what most of you cannot imagine. And you have risen to meet it." The recruits shifted, some glancing at Emily. Their eyes reflected a mixture of awe, understanding, and a touch of humility. They had seen the quiet strength she possessed, the patience, the discipline, the courage that had once seemed ordinary to her, extraordinary to them. The general continued, his gaze sweeping the line. "Your respect is earned, not assumed. It is given where it belongs. And today, you have learned that respect is not given lightly. It is demonstrated through endurance, through sacrifice, and through the courage to rise when others fall." This unit now embodies that lesson. Emily felt a wave of quiet pride, not for herself, but for those standing before her. They had transformed. Where there had once been mockery, arrogance, and doubt, there was now focus, determination, and humility. They had seen the truth of her story, and it had changed them. One recruit, the same who had first approached her weeks ago, stepped forward. His voice, steady but tinged with emotion, broke the formation's silence. "Sergeant Carter," he said, "thank you for showing us what real strength looks like, for teaching us without yelling, without punishment, just by example. We get it now." Emily met his gaze, the weight of her experience reflected in his eyes. She nodded once, quietly, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. "You don't need to thank me," she replied softly. "I didn't do it for that. I did it because someone needed to lead, someone needed to show the way. And you've learned it." Another recruit stepped forward, this one younger, nervous, eyes wide with admiration. "We'll remember. We'll carry it with us," he said, almost reverently. Emily's hands fell to her sides. She had long carried the weight of memory, of pain, of sacrifice. She had hidden her medal for so long because the recognition of others had never been her purpose. Yet now, standing before this group of young soldiers, she realized that her endurance had become more than a personal testament. It had become a guidepost for others. The general's voice drew everyone's attention again. "Soldiers," he said, "take this lesson with you. Every scar, every hardship, every struggle you endure, carry it with integrity. Carry it as a reminder that strength is more than physical. It is moral. It is courage when no one is watching. It is sacrifice without reward, and it is the measure of a soldier." Emily watched as the recruits absorbed the words, their posture shifting subtly, their expressions settling into a quiet determination. They were ready, not just ready for drills, for inspections, or for physical tests, but ready for the moments that mattered most, the moments that demanded courage over comfort, action over hesitation. Later, as the recruits filed back to their barracks, Emily lingered near the parade ground, alone for a moment. She placed a hand over her chest, feeling the metal beneath her uniform. She didn't need to look at it to know it was there. Its weight was not heavy. It was affirming, a quiet echo of all she had endured. She thought of the village, of the children she had led to safety, of the mothers and fathers who had clutched their infants in fear. She thought of the bloodied streets, the shrapnel in her leg, and the determination that had kept her moving. And she thought of the recruits, who had once mocked her limp and now looked to her for guidance. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the scent of dust, sun, and earth. Emily inhaled deeply, letting the stillness wash over her. The war she had fought years ago had left scars, both seen and unseen, but this moment, this quiet acknowledgement of endurance, transformation, and respect offered something she had never fully expected: closure. The recruits would remember. They would carry her lessons forward, applying them when the world demanded courage. And Emily would continue, quietly, steadfastly, walking among them as she always had, a living testament to the fact that true strength was measured not by speed, by appearance, or by perfection, but by the courage to rise, to endure, and to protect, no matter the cost. As the camp settled into evening, Emily walked slowly back to her bunk. Her steps were deliberate, her limp present but irrelevant. She had been mocked, doubted, and dismissed, but she had endured. She had inspired, and she had taught a lesson that would outlast her presence in this place. When she reached her bunk, she finally allowed herself a small, private smile. The medal remained beneath her uniform, hidden from view, but it was more than an object. It was proof not of glory, not of recognition, but of a life lived with courage, integrity, and selfless resolve. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and gold, Emily Carter lay down, letting exhaustion claim her. She was tired, yes, but fulfilled. She had survived battles both seen and unseen. She had led by example. And she had proven, without speaking of it, that true heroism is quiet, unassuming, and immeasurable. The recruits would never forget her. Limp, her hidden medal, or the lessons she had embodied. But Emily herself needed no reminder. She had endured, she had inspired, and she had quietly transformed a Unit 1 soldier at a time. And for her, that was more than enough.